Good morning, everybody, or rather, it's just afternoon, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, nasscom, for the honor to speak to global CEOs of Indian companies, or lots of global CEOs of Indian companies. So it's really a privilege to be here. I only wish there were a few more women in the audience, but I think we'll get there sooner than later, because as you know, we are talking about democratization of technology, and I hope it also leads to gender democratization. So what I'm going to do, the slides are there. I'll leave them for you to sort of look at your leisure. I won't necessarily go through each of the slides. I'm happy to take questions if there is time. But essentially, I want to leave you with a few messages about technology and markets and the need for regulation, which is the topic that I was given by nasscom. Arthur Clarke, the great science fiction writer who sort of died in Sri Lanka and Colombo a few years ago, well, a decade ago, I think. He had said very strikingly that any new technology, any sufficiently advanced new technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think for AI, that remains pretty much true, that it's magic and technology is magic. And as technology has evolved, I think there is a little bit of magic inside that black box, which even the CEOs probably don't know what's happening. I may be wrong, but allow me some poetic license. I have no idea of technology, but I speak on markets and technology, but I don't have much idea of technology. So what I'm going to do is try and sort of take you through an evolution of the markets, look at India's positioning in this market for technology and the opportunities, of course, in globalization and as you say, the hyper-connected world. But if one looks at infrastructure, and digital is infrastructure, right? Digital is inherently infrastructure. And there's a lovely quote by the American President John F. Kennedy many years ago. This was, I think, in the 60s. He said that America has good roads not because it is rich. It is rich because it has good roads. And the sort of implication or the causality of infrastructure on GDP, or it could be roads, it could be electricity, it could be all the physical infrastructure before AI and digital technologies, they had a massive impact on GDP and employment and so on and so forth. And the reason I'm sort of generating this metaphor for you between technology, AI, and the previous technology is because AI and digital technologies, the mobile phone, the fixed line phone, etc., have the same impact. But only thing is that this impact is much more profound, much more pervasive, and also much more damaging, if you will. Roads could also be damaging, electricity could also be damaging in terms of their carbon footprints, but I think the role of AI and digital technology could potentially be much more damaging. So this is, in a sense, a reality check from a helicopter view, really, a reality check of where technology, and I'm not going to, you probably already know the conversations between Zuckerberg and Elon Musk on how far can you push technology and how much should you invest in technology, or whether technology will consume the people who have created it. And there's a lot of science fiction work in the world that suggests that technology could do that, but I'm not going down that road. The problem, I'll park that thought, but the road down which I am going is regulation, hyperconnectedness, and globalization, and of course, digital and AI. And if you look at digital technology itself, fixed line, mobile, then digital, now AI, if you look at the history of the evolution of those technologies, starting from, let's say, AT&T, those of you who are familiar with AT&T are probably also familiar with MTNL and BSNL, and the advent of private competition in Indian markets. Those sort of technologies, etc., when they emerged, they were relatively easier to regulate. The regulators could do it. They had price-based competition. You had quality competition. You had ex-ante competition rules. Thou shalt not have more than 30% of the market share. Thou shalt not engage in predatory pricing, although it's very difficult to sort of judge what predatory pricing is. But you had those ex-ante rules that prevented monopolization, or that prevented, or at least potentially sought to prevent monopolization and abuse of market position by the dominant players in the market. And I'm going to argue, and lots of people have argued, that it's much more difficult to prevent abuse by digital big tech companies, digital giants that we have, and the war between United States and China on AI is something that I will come to in the end, is really premised on the fact that how much of free market competition are you going to allow the big tech giants, and how much of it is going to be damaging within a country and across countries as well. So the point then becomes that if it was easy to regulate, relatively, it's never easy to regulate. And the reason it's never easy to regulate is because the regulated are perhaps a couple of steps ahead of the regulators. And this is definitely true for India, but it's also true for the United States and Europe, which have a much longer tradition of regulation than we have in India. And even the EU Commission, they're having problems of regulating, they have the GDPR rules, and they have problems regulating the big tech companies. They consistently fine the big tech huge amounts, and yet they're unable to prevent the abuse of market power. In the United States, it's been much more laissez-faire, much more open, much more friendly, but they are also now sort of reinventing regulation for big tech and AI. So regulation has been relatively easier for mobiles, for fixed line, for internet, etc., than it has been for digital. And it has, all this while, it has ignored the sources of the growth. And I'm also going to ignore sources of the growth. And simply I'm going to ignore because there's no time to talk about it. And what I meant, as long as GDP increases, if you have more fixed line, you'll have more GDP. If you have more mobiles, you'll have more GDP. We've shown, I've written a paper along with some colleagues, where a 10% increase in mobile telephony will have a 3.2% increase in GDP in India. And for the rest of the world, these results have been replicated across. Now, who that 3.2% goes to, where does the increase of GDP go? Does it create more inequalities? Professor Devi Shetty was talking about democratization, and I will talk about it. Does it lead to more democratization, or does it lead to more inequalities in the system, is something that you have to worry about, the governments have to worry about, you who are creators of the technology have to worry about. But I'm not today going to talk about the carbon footprint that is being created by technologies. And of course, we are no longer talking only about carbon footprints. We know that digital can lead to better decoupling of growth from emissions, from the carbon footprint. We talk about decoupling of GDP from carbon emissions, and technology can enable that. But what do you think of data centers that are water guzzlers and electricity guzzlers in warm climates, right? So, one has to think, so you only focus on the positive, but the water footprint or the carbon footprint of AI is very, very high. We are yet coming to terms with it. IPCC, the International Planetary Committee on Climate Change, hasn't yet gotten into digital sort of technologies or data servers creating that water footprint. But we know that, to meet that 1.5 degree norm, we have to stop coal, we have to stop, we have to have more solar, we have to have more wind. In COP27 in Egypt, they singled out coal as the most harmful of all sources of carbon emissions, while continuing with the rest of fossil fuels as not being harmful. And I want to come back to this point in some sense, because I want to leave these thoughts with you, because you're global sort of, you work for global companies. And in India, somebody talked about, I think I was listening to a panel discussion about, are we creating the rules or are we adopting the rules? Are we at that stage where we can begin to set the rules? And I'll park this thought for a moment, and I'll come back to this thought. I think we can make the rules, but it'll be a tall order as of now, for various reasons, because of colonization if we were to decolonize, as academics call it, then there are some things that we need to put in place. But the fact that technology changes markets is a given. I mean, the simplest example, of course, is now you see markets that exist today, the taxi market, the hotel market, the e-commerce market. Those markets have completely changed, but it's nothing new. Malthus talked about technology, population growth being such that it'll destroy population, it'll kill people because we won't have enough food to eat. That was the Malthusian prediction of the dismal science. Economics, as you know, is the dismal science. That was the Malthusian prediction. But it didn't happen because technology came to the rescue. Today, in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and South Korea, agriculture is only 2% of their GDP, right? And services constitute 70 to 80% of GDP in mature markets. In India, unfortunately, services also contributes a very high amount to GDP, which is about 60%. People like yourselves working in those industries, but that has happened by accident, not by, I think, choice. By choice, we wanted to go the China route and increase manufacturing, but manufacturing for various doing business problems, which you're only so familiar with by being in India, sort of got in the way of, in the form of constraints that led to services-led growth. But this myth that we have in India, that India is very competitive in services, I'm not talking about your services, I'm talking about the 60% that constitute. Yes, we are competitive in IT services. Yes, we are competitive in business process outsourcing or whatever names that you give it now. But we are not competitive in services at all. We are one of the largest exporters of services, but if you disaggregate that, it's not banking services, it's not financial services, it's not business services, it's simply IT services. The only service globally that we are competitive in is IT services. People, the industries. So when we negotiate free trade agreements with countries, services agreements have been really difficult to negotiate because our competitiveness is not in all manner of services. Some of you work for the insurance industry, some of you probably work for the banking industry, and we're not competitive in that. And therefore, we are protecting our insurance industries, we are protecting our banking industries, but we are competitive. So, and just as an aside, I wanted to sort of make that point that sometimes people say a lot of commentary around Indian economy is, I think, misleading because we feel that we are competitive in all services, and which is really not true. So, as I said, that regulating those markets that, not the digital market, I'm going to come to that, regulating those markets of telecommunications and mobile, as I said, was so much easier to do, and regulators were able to do that across the world. In US, and you have spectrum auctions. Sometimes you don't like the results of those spectrum auctions, but they are auctioned. Sometimes they're given out by beauty contest, which is sometimes not the best way to do it, but beauty contests in Europe have been also held. In India, we've now moved to auctions. And so you regulate those markets, access to spectrum is regulated, and so on and so forth. But digital markets, what are you going to regulate? It's not just telecom. Telecom today, the world over, doesn't exist, or mobile doesn't exist for its own sake. It's actually it exists for the sake of other industries, and NASScom itself has done several reports on digitalization and digitization of Indian companies, after having done lots of reports of digitization of helping digitization in other countries. There is a big vacuum of digitalization and digitization within India as well. But it's not just for one industry, it's across industries, it's across sectors. It's health, it's medical, it's pharmaceuticals, it could be manufacturing, it could be automobiles, it could be any sector, chemicals, agriculture. So what are you going to regulate? Are you going to regulate each of these sectors, or are you going to regulate digital or data services? Data, as they say, is the new oil, but if you talk to activists, they will tell you data is the new toxic. The reality, of course, lies somewhere in between, which is why the Indian data protection bill has been so late in coming, and it's still with Parliament. It hasn't yet been passed yet. And the reason is simple, because it's very complex. We still don't know whether a data protection authority is going to be a singular authority that will exist to regulate all sectors, or whether RBI is going to regulate its own data, whether the Department of Health is going to regulate its own medical data, whether the automobile sector is going to regulate its own data, etc. Some of them will be non-sensitive, but some of them will be sensitive. Some of this data will be subject to what is called localization. And I'm sure you're familiar with, if you work in data, if you work on AI, you're probably already familiar with localization. And the kind of passionate discourse that happened around localization in India. Localization could lead to, some others capturing the Indian market for data, or cross-border data flows, if they are allowed, could lead to some other outcomes. So we have to do it very carefully. It's not clear yet, but I think the government of India has taken a stand that hard, sort of wired data localization will not serve the interests of India, and I agree with that. You could have mirroring, you could have other forms of localization that are not so intrusive, that impose costs not on the big companies, but on the smaller companies. But the question becomes, regulation is for several reasons. Regulations is for protecting your citizens, protecting the data of your citizens. When you're in a hyper-connected world that we were in all these years, and I'll talk you through that a little bit so that you understand what is happening with AI. But, if you have fragmentation, then it doesn't work well for hyperconnectivity or globalization. Okay, let me just step back a little bit. When globalization was at its peak in the world, and you're familiar with the peak globalization, the early 2000s, just before the financial crisis hit, you sort of open your laptop, or you open your phone, or you open any gadget, electronic gadget. As students of international trade, we were taught that a country has a comparative advantage in producing cars, and therefore America exports cars. We have a comparative advantage in producing handicrafts, because that is labor intensive, and we export handicrafts. And that was the sort of idea that we had in the 70s and 80s. But in 90s, post-dot-com, post-Y2K, post-globalization, the hyper form of globalization, which of course communications enhanced and made pervasive, markets became hyper-connected. And there was specialization not in products, there was specialization in tasks. What you people do in small tasks. As I said, you open your phone, you'll find components that are made in 50 countries. You imagine shipping in and out, regional value chains or global value chains, shipping those components between countries because it was more efficient to do so. That's why people did it. People like yourself, GCCs are being set up in India because it is more efficient to do it, because it's cost effective. You have large skill, you have a large pool of skilled labor at scale that you cannot find in any other country, an English-speaking standard which seems to dominate the world of AI. So those advantages exist in India, and therefore we've been able to take advantage of this capability and capacity. But what has happened to globalization, and I see I have just a couple of minutes left, what has happened to globalization after the global financial crisis of 2008, after COVID, and after the China-US war, is that on the face of it, there is a lot of discontent with globalization. There is talk of China plus one, there is a talk of diversification away from China, there's talk of de-risking, etc. What have you. People want to de-risk, move away from China, etc., which means that I still want to remain connected, but I want to remain connected on my terms. Therefore, I'm becoming protectionist. The form that protectionism takes in a hyper-connected world, where tariff barriers have almost come down to zero, not in India, but the rest of the world, tariff barriers are almost down to zero. What is the form that protectionism is taking? You can't tell me today that Europe and America don't use protectionism. Think about President Trump, this is an aside, imposing on flyers to the United States through the Middle East that your laptop and your iPads or whatever, your tablets, will not be allowed to be checked in and have to go in your check-in baggage. That was some security measure. You can invoke security for anything. But I'm asking you whether that was, I don't have the answer, but I'm just putting it out as a question, whether that was a protectionist measure or whether it was a security measure. If it was a protectionist measure, it takes the form of what economists call non-tariff barriers. Data localization is a non-tariff barrier. It could be due to security, or it could be just due to protectionism. There is no way to find out ex ante for any regulator whether it's going to breach security or not. So this is a complex issue, but globalization has become much less tariffs. Tariffs are easy, pricing and so on, 10% tariff, 5% tariff. WTO has enabled the world to negotiate almost zero tariffs. India is an exception, but agriculture and cars, etc., we still impose tariffs on. But most of the protectionism in the rest of the world is non-tariff. President Trump was imposing non-tariff barriers when he promised that US will try and decouple from China. That was rhetoric meant for a constituency that was going to vote for him. But what is happening China is the largest trading partner for 150 countries today, including India, maybe number 1 or number 2. China is India's first or second largest trading partner. Is it easy to decouple from China? What will happen to all the pharmaceutical formulations? What will happen to all the rare earths? What will happen to all the efficient components and products that come in from China? It's not so easy to decouple. Consumers have to be willing to pay higher prices in the United States if you're going to sort of decouple or try and move away from China. Of course. It's not easy, but the world today is not unipolar. The unipolar world of the 2000, which is why United States is feeling so uncomfortable today with the rise of China, and I don't know how it will be managed or even accommodated, or what will be the repercussion. But a two-polar world or a three-polar world is going to be very different in terms of trade, in terms of connectivity, than a unipolar world was. When you have a hegemon like the United States, and you're doing things according to the standards set by the hegemon, and the hegemon is happy, everybody else is happy. Today, India is not happy, as was said in one of the panel discussions. And, I'm sure you'll come across this sometime in your engagement with the US, with the Europeans. Whose rules? Whose order? Why are we subject all the time to the rules that have been set by the Anglo-Saxon world? I'm not saying this to provoke you. I know a lot of you have CEOs of Anglo-Saxon origin or on global companies that are run by people of Anglo-Saxon origin. This is not to provoke. It is to say that in a fair world, when there is emergence of China, when there is an emergence of India and other countries, who sets the rules? I'll give you an example, right? My pet example. I'm sort of international. I teach economics and trade, etc. America used to give $2 billion of subsidy, it still does, to its farmers through income transfers. So does Europe. They have a common agricultural policy. But they were very unhappy with the kind of support that we gave to our farmers in the form of minimum price support. They said it was distortionary, it distorts markets. Yes, it distorts market, but what does the $2 billion of subsidy do? Does it not distort markets? But they created an orange box, a red box, and a green box. Their subsidies went into a green box, which was all fair and fine. Our subsidies went into the red box, it was not fine. I may be exaggerating, but the point is the developing world, including China, including the G20 now, which is going to be held in September, I'm not saying you're rebelling against that, but when you talk about data, when you're talking about cross-border data flows, we shouldn't just say that data localization is being imposed to protect our industry. It is being imposed for certain reasons. It shouldn't just be a flippant dismissal of agenda which government of India is following. I know government of India does sort of a lot of things under pressure and so on, but now for you to be able to take the stand that we have arrived and we can actually, it'll be some time. 5G standards are all being set. outside India. There will be a time when we become exporters of intellectual property. I'm sure your global capability centers will be filing patents, will be sort of creating products which you can file patents for, etc. And if you wish to go to the market or go outside your own companies, you'll be able to do that. But that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that if we are able to, as Indians, produce intellectual property, then we can become exporters of intellectual property. On the iPhone, you all know this, the smiley curve that was done in the OECD. Many, many years ago, there was a smiley curve of, value addition on the iPhone. 40% of the value addition, the design, goes to the United States. 40% of it goes to, after-sales service and so on. The rest of the 20% is divided between several countries, including China, South Korea, that provide the components, that provide the chips. But the design, the intellectual property, gets the major share of the returns. And that is true for any product. It's the design, it's the intellectual property that receives the major share. So, last point I'm going to make, and I'll be happy if I'm already exceeded time, but I'm happy to take questions if there are any. This is sort of relating to what Dr. Devi Shetty said, and I'm sure he is absolutely right, because it gives the ability to, doctors can't go out, and we know in India it's been so difficult to get doctors to work in rural areas, but technology now increases the reach of good medical advice and even, remote surgeries, etc. So all that is given, everything has happened. But what has happened post-COVID? I think especially the sector that I'm in education, I'm sure a number of you will be in education. What COVID, or post-COVID, if I can call this era post-COVID, what COVID has shown that actually it has created another divide between the people who've learned and the people who haven't. And because access to technology is not simply having a phone or having a laptop or having a computer, it's the ability to internalize. And I think that's a big discussion that we can have about India, how that divide about the ability to internalize technology or to learn or adapt to technology it's a huge divide. So while technology on the one side, AI on the one side, can actually democratize because it gives access, and there are wonderful stories, inspiring stories, emotional stories, people from, and I know these stories, people from, very deprived backgrounds, come from homes which are broken, come from homes which are, absolutely living below the poverty line, how technology has enabled, empowered them. And one of our graduates from that sort of humble beginnings, not even humble beginning, less than humble beginning, is now sitting with a full scholarship in Stanford University. So you have those examples, but you also have several more examples how technology is creating more divides than it is helping to address. So I think the message for you is that, while markets, you access global markets in a hyper-connected world, you'll worry about these non-tariff barriers, data regulations, the panopticons, the surveillance, the George Orwellian sort of kind of dystopia that exists around data. And I'm calling it dystopia because it's real, it does exist. We've heard elections being incentivized, or lack of it, by access to data, and how elections have been manipulated by access to data. So we know all of that, this kind of dystopia that data is able to create. But what you don't necessarily appreciate every day is the sort of good that technology can do at the lower levels, technology for social good. This is, of course, India's attempt at the G20 to do what the DPIs are doing, the digital public infrastructure in the finance space. I haven't spoken about that space, but that is something that India is trying to export to the rest of the world, so that access to credit, access to money, access to debit or payment options are available to everybody, and that is a reality. It has really democratized access. A pan wala, a cigarette wala today accept Paytm payments or Google Pay, etc. And that's a very, very good thing, I think. And that technology has created, but technology, as I said, in education has also created divides. So we have to try and sort of be able to speak not only to the top of the pyramid, which is relatively easier, but we need to also speak to the bottom of the pyramid. And I think that's where India's strength lies. So the huge markets that we have everything. We have more billionaires than India, than Russia. At its level of per capita income, we had the largest number of billionaires in India for a level of per capita income, any country in history, which tells you something about the inequality. But we also have huge scale that technology can use and bring to the common people, just like financial fintech technology. So sort of India is a laboratory for everyone to be able to operate. Thank you for listening to me. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
For more content on tech and leadership, subscribe to NASScom YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.